Thanks so much, Donna. Can I invite Laurie and your team of presenters for the next panel to come up? I also want to personally thank Donna. We were co-exhibitors 30 years ago in a seminal show, and it's great to see you 30 years later here. Let me just find it. So, do you want to explain the format again, like yesterday, or should I just? Yeah, okay. So it's a Pecha format, and so we have a timed slide presentation, and and the topic is Gender and Family Politics Career Preparation. Laurie Brown is the moderator.
Hi, I'm Heidi. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Laurie Brown, and I'm an associate professor at Syracuse University School of Architecture and the co-founder and co-leader of Architects, a women an architectural group in New York City, and we're very interested in bridging between the academy and practice. So I'm going to be the moderator of this session and the instigator for the workshop afterwards. And the format, for those of you who weren't here yesterday, everyone has 7 minutes in a Pecha format, and then we're going to have a workshop in terms of, it's not a Q&A, but we want ideas, actions to take forward, to move beyond, that we bring back to our home institutions for working on and helping change these issues. So please think about and respond to and build upon what will be presented so that we'll be taking notes. Carol Burns has so generously said she would be our scribe again today, as she was yesterday. So thank you very much. I'm going to introduce the panel, the participants, and just giving you their affiliation, and so it'll be very brief in the order in which they're going to be presenting. So we have Elisa Iturbe from Yale University School of Architecture. She's a third-year student, and she's the co-founder of Equality and Design Organization at Yale. The next will be Marc, Neveu, and Ingalill Wahlroos-Ritter from Woodbury University School of Architecture, and then Kelly Huzel from Carnegie Mellon School of Architecture, who also teaches in Qatar. And then Maya Alexander, who's a student at Yale University School of Architecture and also the co-founder for the Equality and Design Organization. Next will be Victoria Rosner. She is an English professor of literature at Columbia University, and she's also Dean of Academic Affairs. Then we'll have Heidi Hussa, who is from New Jersey Institute of Technology, and she's a student, a third year architecture student. And then we will conclude with Harriet, who is at Oxford Brookes University, Faculty of Technology, Design, and Environment, a principal lecturer and coordinator of the Applied Design and Architecture program. So with that, we will begin.
Good morning. In the history of sexuality, Foucault does not ask, why are we repressed? He asks, why do we say we are repressed? Of course, Foucault asked us in order to question the way sex is put into discourse, which is beyond our scope today. But I reference it because it reminds me of a common attitude I've experienced within architecture school. I'm asked, why do women say there's inequality in architecture school? Women have equal enrollment, women get awards, women get TA-ships. The quality of our work is, for the most part, recognized. But there's a discomfort that is hard to name. As such, I would like to focus on the constitution of female identity, specifically within the context of architecture school. Architecture schools are unique because our work is performed. We are evaluated in reviews, critiques, and pinups. We present to an audience, and our performance as well as our work is evaluated by our professors and peers. So there are 2 things I would like to discuss. The first is the female body in the context of performance, and the second is the performance itself as it relates to the expectations of architecture school. So first, the female body. Our bodies are on display as we present, and as such, we participate in the visual representation of women. The female image is something that women have to deal with every day. We are constantly compared and contrasted to other female bodies, and we are trained to seek empowerment through the ability to engender desire. That is something that we as women carry with us wherever we go. It's helpful to cite Laura Mulvey, who famously analyzed the to-be-looked-at-ness of the female body. Mulvey argues that in film, the appearance of the woman is coded for strong visual and erotic impact. This is relevant to architecture school because we have to engage visuality in the moment we are reviewed. Our bodies are part of the tableau. And Mulvey argues there are basic differences between beholding a male and beholding a female. The representation of femininity exists within a long tradition of constructing desire. On the other hand, the representation of masculinity has a narcissistic effect, engendering a moment of ego reinforcement for the male spectator. Mulvey's analysis assumes a male audience, but that is quite common in the context of studio. I would argue that this has an unstated but potentially very significant impact and immediately puts female students in a different position than male students. Spectatorship is inflected by gender. To support this theory, one need only look at the famous example of orchestra auditions, where as soon as a screen was used to make the auditions gender-blind, the ratio of women to men in orchestras in the US went up by 20%. As to architecture, one can imagine a male professor seeing himself reflected in the performance of a male student rather than a female student and unwittingly generating bias. The obvious thing to say here is that we should have more female studio critics, but this also brings me to my second topic, which is about performance. There is a very real relationship between performer and audience. The audience arrives with preconceived notions about gender norms, and those norms inflect how the performance is received. Drawing from Jill Dolan, who writes about gender in performance art, I'd like to suggest that as we perform, we move towards or away from traditional expectations of women. So in the way that all women must contend with the visual representation of women in our culture, we must also contend with the cultural expectations of behavior. But of course, in architecture school, we have the confluence of wider cultural norms and the norms of architecture culture. According to Judith Butler, the construction of gender is a performance that relies on a repetition of norms. Butler writes, "The action of gender requires a performance that is repeated. This repetition is at once a reenactment and re-experiencing of a set of meanings already socially established, and it is a mundane and ritualized form of their legitimation." In other words, in the moment of performing a gender norm, the norm is both repeated and legitimized. This image is from a classic childhood movie from the 90s, The Sandlot. The scene is an epic sling of insults between neighborhood baseball teams. The confrontation ends with a heinous slander, "You play ball like a girl." At the utterance of this statement, all boys fall silent. In disbelief, the offended parties challenge the opposing team to a game where things can be resolved in a manly fashion. This is a playful example but indicative. The boys' performance in the game is inextricably linked with the performance of masculinity. In other words, the standard of excellence is set by gender. I wonder if in architecture school we're afraid of something else. You design like a girl, or you present like a girl. Because in studio, we are expected to play ball like a boy. We're expected to follow the standard of excellence that has been set by the men of our discipline, to follow the cultural norms in architecture school that constitute a very specific formula of success. This formula is heavy with a masculine history. So on top of the visual representation of women, on top of the cultural standards of behavior, women in architecture must also contend with the masculinized expectations of success within studio. So perhaps here lies some of the discomfort of being a woman in architecture school. In some ways, I feel like I'm in dangerous territory because I do not want to claim that outspokenness or assertiveness are purely masculine qualities. The goal is rather to point out certain cultural biases within architecture and to suggest that these may be in conflict with not only wider cultural expectations, but also with our expectations for ourselves as women. The female body inhabits the intersection of multiple cultural forces, and in architecture school specifically, cultural norms conflict with architectural norms. On one hand, femininity is expected as our bodies engage visuality in our presentations, but femininity is rejected as we're asked to speak loudly and boldly to an audience of men. There is a strange tacit discomfort, a discomfort that is hard to name. And again, I would like to clarify that I'm not looking to assign specific behaviors to either gender. I simply would like to analyze how studio culture asks us to both perform and reject gendered expectations, and in doing so creates a condition in which women are constantly bumping up against barriers to self-determination. But we can question and reshape what a woman in architecture looks like. I'm also calling these issues tacit discomforts because sexism is not what it used to be. I'm not hearing a lot of demand for me to stay in the kitchen these days. But the barriers to women are undoubtedly there. Perhaps to name these barriers is to see them better, and seeing them will inevitably help us find a clearer path forward. Thank you.
Welcome. According to the Urban Dictionary, the term man up is a verb with a variety of definitions, two of which are as follows. Forget about your problems because you were born with a penis. Therefore, it's not important to anyone that you have problems. Be silent and accept your suffering because you have testicles. The machismo implied in the phrase is one that, in my experience at least, is pervasive in architecture school culture and one that often continues into practice. Architecture, I was told, was not a profession but a lifestyle. If I wanted to be successful, I should man up. While not promoting a feminist agenda per se, faculty at Woodbury, and especially those in our technology sequence, provide a different perspective. The following slides are an attempt to show you just a little bit about what we do.
Linda Tallman runs her own award-winning office that specializes in prefabricated component systems. Tallman is a registered architect in New York and California, has lectured on the collaborative nature of her practice at universities throughout the United States. Her work has been exhibited widely throughout the world at institutions such as MoMA, Art Basel, and the Vitra Design Museum. She's taught at a variety of institutions in Los Angeles and New York before arriving to Woodbury. For the past few years, Linda has coordinated the comprehensive design studios for both graduate and undergraduate. She's currently on sabbatical, researching the recent history of prefabricated housing, and has at least 20 projects on the boards. Koji Shiraka is structural engineer educated at Michigan State. She's lived in Los Angeles for much of her life and has rather incredibly taught at Woodbury since 1987. By a rough count, this means she's taught structures to more than 3,000 students at Woodbury. She owns her own office, and her work as a structural engineer spans Southern California. Koji has worked directly on a number of projects at Woodbury. You'll often see her with students in various buildings on campus, not in the classroom that she was assigned, but rather in spaces on which she worked. There, she works with students in situ to discuss real and potential structural solutions and details.
Ingalill, Wahlroos-Ritter, is an architect, educator, and design consultant specializing in the building envelope and experimental use of glass. Her expertise in facade design and materials is brought into the classroom in both comprehensive design studios as well as building material courses. She is the associate dean of our school and has been chair of both the undergraduate and graduate programs. She's listed as co-author of this presentation, in part because we worked on the presentation together, but perhaps more importantly, she's played a key role in hiring many of our faculty over the past decade. Catherine Herbst is the chair of our San Diego campus. She was the project architect on a number of acclaimed projects in the office of Rob Wellington Quigley. In 2000, she partnered with Todd Reinhardt to establish an office that has, since the founding, worked on a variety of housing projects in the San Diego area. She's a self-described accidental academic. Catherine teaches across the curriculum, but has particular focus on building systems. She renovated the architecture program in San Diego, and one that, she is proud to note, has no air conditioning or heating systems. This irony is not lost on the students in her systems courses who are sweating in August.
Kristen King has taught at Woodbury since 2006, after over 15 years of professional practice. She recently stepped down as chair of the Interior Architecture Department and is pursuing a graduate degree in fine arts, where she's developing her creative practice along with technical expertise. She continues to teach in building systems courses with a specialty in lighting design. Beginning in the next academic year, Kristen will be the lead researcher working in a new lighting lab that has been supported by a $2.8 million federal grant. This is the second Promoting Post-Baccalaureate Opportunities for Hispanic American grant that Woodbury has received, a Title V grant. After working for the award-winning architecture and landscape firm Franco Zagari Architetti in Rome, Donatella Kusma moved to Los Angeles in 2004, where she worked with Tracy Stone Architects, a LEED certified firm with expertise in green and sustainable design. In 2008, Kusma founded Claret Cup, a multidisciplinary and collaborative practice combining architecture, fashion, and graphic design. Kusma's work includes the design of a prototype for a new school and community center in the earthquake-devastated area of Kashmir in northern India, in collaboration with NGO Kashmir Earthquake Relief and Samina Sitabgan. She currently teaches studio tectonics as well as a BIM workshop.
Liz Malo co-owns Noose Engineering, a structural engineering company based in downtown LA that specializes in creating temporary and permanent spaces for art installations, international organizations, agencies, developers, and even a few governments. Most recently, as Elizabeth and her team traveled to West Africa to work with the Liberian government on upgrading their hospital structural standards. She's taught advanced structures at Woodbury for almost 5 years and is a structural consultant for all of our comprehensive design studios. Janine Centuri is principal and co-founder of Urban Rock Design, an art, architecture, and design studio. She's been the chair of the architecture department in Los Angeles and currently directs the ACE Center, the Architecture for Civic Engagement group. The ACE Center connects students and faculty with nonprofit and governmental organizations that are dedicated to helping underserved communities. Students work collaboratively across disciplines to combine their skills and test their fields of study on real projects for the public good. Projects include architectural design build, business plans for organizations, graphic design, including wayfinding signage and logos, films, videos, as well as journalistic and creative writing. Not unlike other schools, our student population is split evenly between men and women. Recent numbers relating to practice, however, show much more of an imbalance, 15, 10, and even 5 years out of school. There are, of course, a number of reasons for this. The faculty at Woodbury demonstrate that architectural agency can be made manifest in a variety of ways. And with all due respect to that previous president of Harvard University, women, it seems, are pretty good at the science and engineering of architecture.
Good morning. For the past 8 years, I've taught architecture courses at Carnegie Mellon University's campus in Doha, Qatar. A small monarchy on the Arabian Peninsula, about the size of the state of Connecticut, Qatar is bordered only by Saudi Arabia to the southwest. I don't cover my head. I teach my courses in English, and I can drive a car. These are questions that I frequently face, mostly from Americans, about what it's like to be a woman in the Middle East. Qatar is in the midst of an explosive transformation, driven by its ambition and fueled by the fact that it's the world's largest or fourth largest producer of natural gas. In preparation for a post-petroleum era, the country is currently diversifying its economy with a focus on culture, health, sports, and education. The 2014 national budget reflects these priorities, $62 billion USD, basically to build a new port, expand a new airport, build light rail, improve roadways, and build hotel and stadia in a race to host the World Cup in 2022. Of course, progress does not happen without challenges or without scrutiny. There are three things that you frequently hear about this part of the world. One, that they're building at a breakneck speed. Two, that construction workers are underpaid. And three, that women are treated as second-class citizens. While there's some truth to all of these, there's a much more nuanced picture. The population has trebled in 10 years and now exceeds 2 million. Most people in Qatar are working to build Qatar, and with the influx of migrant laborers, men outnumber women 3 to 1. Qataris currently account for only 1/5 of the population. Young women typically marry at an early age, often within the family. And as the society changes, Qataris struggle to maintain their local culture and identity. I teach in a place called Education City, initiative of the Qatar Foundation, and the vision of a woman, Her Highness Sheikha Moza. Education City is best described as a multiversity. It's now home to 8 international universities. At Carnegie Mellon, I teach 2 student groups, Pittsburgh architecture students who are studying abroad and Doha-based non-majors to whom I offer a minor in architecture. For both groups, I use our campus as a laboratory with brand new buildings by Legarreta and Legarreta, OMA, among others, that offers valuable lessons. Recently, my class toured the new Faculty of Islamic Studies building by the firm Mangara Yovars, and it's really no accident that this is the most avant-garde building on campus. It speaks to Qatar's ambition to define contemporary Islamic identity and culture. I find that here the issue of identity, whose identity, takes on great importance. Seemingly superficial, these discussions often speak to much deeper issues. At Carnegie Mellon, Qatar, 40% of the student enrollment is Qatari. The other 60% hail from 44 different countries, yet many are born and raised in Doha. The word gender gap typically evokes the notion of female disadvantage and male dominance. However, in Qatar, there's one important area where this is not the case: higher education. Female universities in Qatar outnumber men 2 to 1. Partly because of this, and partly because of the fact that architecture is often considered engineering in this part of the world, the enrollment in my classes is overwhelmingly female. Nearby Qatar University, a public institution, offers the only Bachelor of Architecture degree in the country on a gender-segregated campus, and to women only. These are 2 of my former students. May is currently pursuing a PhD at the London School of Economics, and after receiving her Master of Art from the Royal College of Art in London, Miriam is working at Qatar Foundation's Center for Design Innovation. At Qatar Foundation, the department which oversees the design and construction of the campus is majority Qatari and overwhelmingly female, with most under the age of 35. And these aren't just office jobs. These women critique design, they travel to do so, and they're out on the construction site. They tell me that they're treated with great respect from architects and contractors alike. And I'm treated with great respect by my students. My office door is always open, and they come all the time, anytime. In my early years of teaching, I perhaps would have grimaced at being labeled as nurturing or generous or approachable, but teaching in Qatar has led me to embrace these labels. I strive to provide mentorship to my students, but really I think I learn as much from them as they do from me. In a recent workshop with Education City students called Tasmeem, we constructed a curiosity cabinet of found objects reflecting this rapidly changing city and this point of time. It was a chance to work with students across Education City's campus. Most of them were female. And we found that as we collected these found objects, what was harder to represent was basically the transformative role of education, the falling birth rate, the climbing divorce rate, and the increased percentage of women in the workforce. This first generation of female graduates has the potential to radically transform their world. Sheha Moses' dream has become a grand experiment. These young women will likely redefine their public and private spheres. And I think that this slow sea change will likely be felt long after the current construction boom is a distant memory. Thank you.
At its most basic, Equality in Design is a student organization, and it should be noted the only official one at the Yale School of Architecture. At its most ambitious, it is a platform to expose, discuss, and manipulate gender inequality in architecture. We are concerned with achieving equality within academia, the profession, as well as in the production of space. Since its foundation in 2013 by myself and my colleague Elisa Iturbe, the group has become an important part of student life at YSOA. With that being said, we still have a long way to go in changing ingrained behaviors. I don't believe it will come as a surprise to anyone that the architecture school at Yale has a strong male presence, and much of its identity is defined within this legacy. This notion was challenged, however, in 2012 when the school's women alumni group sponsored a symposium titled Yale Women in Architecture. The pixelated picture I have here was one of the only I could find commemorating the weekend, and I believe it is indicative of how it was treated within the school. The event featured a diverse selection of the school's most talented and knowledgeable alumna. There was only one problem: it was almost all women in attendance. Even more alarming was an email sent only to the female members of the student body, inviting them to the event and offering to sponsor the attendance fee. In theory, this should not be a cause for alarm, but it essentially left the school feeling an awkward divide, and the strong history of women at Yale wasn't being disseminated to the student body as a whole, thus continuing to perpetuate its male-dominated lineage. I'm not implying that the symposium or its coordinators were at fault, and the few students who attended found the event to be very productive and enlightening, but I believe it was an important litmus test of how we value women in architecture. Here you had an auditorium filled with practicing women architects, academics, developers, artists, and most of the student body, women and men alike, didn't even feel compelled to attend. This was extremely alarming to Elisa and I, and we felt we needed to do something to raise awareness of women in architecture, both their struggles and their successes. That slide there was showing the result of a Google image search for women in architecture, and I think it is immediately obvious how limited this representation currently is. As we began to formulate the tone and mission of our nascent group, it was important to take stock of these broader misconceptions, as well as the more subtle ones that we knew existed within the architecture community. 2 years ago, when the designs were revealed for Zaha Hadid's Al Wakra Stadium, the media had a field day. Whether you like the stadium or not, or agree or deny its resemblance to female genitalia, we found it highly problematic that a woman architect was confronted with such shallow and childish responses to her work. In an interview with Time magazine, Hadid said, "It's really embarrassing that they come up with nonsense like this. What are they saying? Everything with a hole in it is a vagina? That's ridiculous." Taking stock of the problems we observed within the school and the broader community, we began to formulate our mission statement, beginning this way. As a coalition of committed students, equality in design demands that architecture become a profession that provides equal access for all who aspire to its pursuits. What may appear to be a very simple fact in this opening statement was actually quite important to our group, and that was merely that students were organizing to address issues that were important to them. We felt this was seriously lacking in the student culture, and it was crucial to present this organization as a source of agency. Additionally, we did not want to limit our membership and knew that we could only strengthen our cause by reaching to a broad community. Thus, we avoided the impetus to identify ourselves by our gender, but instead by our mission, equality. We have found that our events do attract a broad audience, and we believe that this is related to our second tenet of the mission statement, which is that we recognize the power architects have in shaping society and the built environment. As such, our goals do not simply remain within changing the demographics of the profession, although this is imperative, but extend into emphasizing the importance of designing equitable space. And this is where our mission gets into the culture of the architecture studio. We hope that our group can help to promote and facilitate conversations that address the ways that our designs can challenge or reify inequity in the built environment. Last year, we held an event that was meant to address some of these questions head on. We were fortunate enough to get Professors Dolores Hayden and Pier Vittorio Orelli to engage in a conversation on gender and housing. Both individuals brought a wide breadth of knowledge on this topic. Hayden is the author of Redesigning the American Dream and the Grand Domestic Revolution, and Orelli has taught multiple studios at Yale that challenge domesticity and ask students to consider how our society is produced and reproduced by domestic architecture. The political realm of the home as a space of agency for the architect was a position that engaged many students and generated a productive discussion. The third tenet of our mission statement, through academic investigation, professional workshops, open discussions, and interdisciplinary collaboration, our group is working from various angles to identify and challenge barriers to equity that exist in architecture. And we have made a concerted effort to provide a range of events that meet these goals. Some of our most well-attended have been our Brown Bag Lunch series, which merely provide a time and place for underrepresented women faculty to present their work or research. We've also organized a Wikipedia edit-a-thon to promote more women editors and more women entries. And for 2 consecutive years, we have held a salary negotiation workshop open to all, but targeting some of the issues specifically facing women in negotiations. We're also starting a tote bag series that exhibits drawings of women architects, the first being Lena Bobardi. In our last tenet, we seek to contextualize our role as members of the Yale community in this ongoing struggle. A new project that we hope to pursue deals with the alarming omission of women from the Manuscripts and Archives collection at Yale. This is a list of the collections that are currently acquired. Although it contains some of the most important contributors to the history of architecture, it is the opposite of the symposium I spoke of earlier, with the representation of only one woman, the landscape architect, Diana Balmori. We see an opportunity to reach out to many of the alumni that were involved in the symposium, for example, people such as Maya Lin or Marion Weiss, and work to expand this history to include these crucial members. In the last tenet of our mission statement, we state that we are the students of an academic institution that has always played an important role in producing architects and contributing to the architectural history and thought. Knowing this, we have identified a unique source of agency that compels us to organize, cultivate a collective consciousness, and work together to create the world of architecture that we know is possible. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the comments and questions about our goals and work so far.
Good morning. The organizers of this event have gathered us here today because, as their poster proclaims, many architecture educators struggle for fair exposure, opportunity, and support in our discipline. What I'd like to suggest today is that architecture educators may be overlooking an important site of support and stimulation, as well as a chance to educate the next generations of students about the important role of architecture in feminist praxis. As all of us gathered here today know well, recent decades have seen an outpouring of scholarship on the role of gender and sexuality in architecture's history, theory, and practice. The works you see on the slide and many others help us to understand how the built environment is organized around gender and sexuality, and how architectural design and practice can participate in gendered and sexual identity. At most U.S. universities, the institutional home for scholars interested in questions related to gender, sexuality, and feminism is the Department of Gender Studies. But in the faculty and curricula of these programs, as I'll discuss, architecture is hardly ever seen. It's long been my anecdotal sense that architecture is not well represented in gender studies, but in preparation for today, I conducted a survey of 15 U.S. universities. I don't know if it's representative, but I hope so, that offer an undergraduate major in architecture. I went looking for possible connections between architecture and women's and gender studies in both curriculum and faculty, and I will share with you what I found. Of the 15 schools I canvassed, 4 offered a BS in architecture and the other 11 a BA. On the gender studies side, 12 of the 15 schools offered a major. I surveyed course descriptions and, when available, syllabi to collect information on the content of core courses in gender studies. Introductory gender studies courses are notably wide-ranging in their disciplinary scope. For instance, a course at the University of Pittsburgh includes readings in sociology, law, philosophy, ecology, race, and ethnicity studies, as well as disability studies. At MIT, the same course contains materials drawn from history, literature, psychology, media studies, medicine, and political science. The Center for Women's and Gender Studies at UT Austin has many research clusters, although architecture is not among them, as you can see. No core courses in the 15 programs included architecture or the built environment as a topic for consideration in gender studies. I also looked to see whether there were faculty in architecture who had institutional connections to departments of gender studies. Most such programs have 2 categories of faculty members: core appointments, where tenure lines are based in gender studies, and affiliations, a more informal connection. None of the 15 schools had faculty members in architecture with tenure lines in gender studies. Only 3 of the schools, you better go back. Only 3 of the schools had even 1 faculty member on their lengthy lists of affiliates. Yet the disciplines of affiliates was wildly diverse. Almost all the arts and sciences were represented, as well as faculty from medical schools, nursing schools, schools of public health, of journalism, of international affairs, of law. Architecture was actually a singular and glaring omission. Why? Why is architecture missing? Law, medicine, international affairs, yes, not architecture. I can only adduce an historical explanation for this absence, that architecture was just not central among the disciplines that participated in the founding of gender studies in the US in the 1970s. And indeed, those founding disciplines, English, my discipline, psychology, sociology, anthropology, French, and a few others, continue to predominate today. Further, it's been my observation that feminist critics of architecture more frequently publish in discipline-specific venues rather than sending their work to interdisciplinary publications in gender studies. There are certainly many exceptions to this rule. This is my favorite, the famous issue number 11 of the defunct journal Heresies, Making Room, Women in Architecture. God, I loved it when I found this. But what is lost today for feminist architecture faculty members who do not participate in the work of women's and gender studies? For one, access to a network of like-minded scholars who might provide inspiration, mentoring, and collegiality. Architecture faculty are also missing the opportunity to participate in cross-disciplinary gender studies research. I would suggest that architecture faculty pursue affiliations with their gender studies departments, which can often be had just for the asking. Faculty might also consider asking for gender studies co-sponsorship to get the gender studies community involved in events like this one, and I don't see anyone from gender studies here. More ambitiously, I would love to see joint appointments, team teaching, and architecture faculty participating in gender studies governance and curriculum development. Okay. What is lost when gender studies students are not taught about the significance of architecture and the built environment for thinking about gender? I'm not the best person in the room to answer this question, but certainly an opportunity to teach students about the importance of thinking about gender and sexuality when negotiating their relationships with space and place. I can't resist the Lacan here. Further, a cadre of feminist students who will graduate from college and enter the professions are not led to think about a career in architecture as a choice for those who are engaged by questions of gender and sexuality, which is a loss, I think, for the profession. Speaking personally, I have found my own teaching in gender studies to be some of the most rewarding I've done, and just as a pitch, I'm going to share with you a couple of my experiences. In spring 2013, I team taught with my colleague Mary McLeod a core course in the Columbia undergraduate gender studies major, which we presented under the title Gender in the Built Environment. We designed this course as an historical introduction to 19th century feminist approaches to the built environment, looking at works by figures including Catherine Beecher, Christine Frederick, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Harriet Jacobs, Virginia Woolf, and many more. For the students, all majors, versed as they were in gender studies, the idea that architecture was a core discipline for their major was completely revelatory. We discussed the doctrine of separate spheres, women's work in the Victorian period, the U.S. plantation household, domestic reform movements, scientific management in the home, lots more. We also invited the students to become involved in a related project Mary and I are directing, the preparation of an online archive of profiles of 50 early 20th century women architects. We trained the students in primary research techniques and set them loose to try and make discoveries and compile profiles of these mostly obscure women architects. It was our hope that the project would help to show the students how historical writing is made, as well as documenting for them as plainly as possible the extent to which women architects have been omitted from the historical record, their work set aside or attributed to their male colleagues. The undergraduates in our class, all gender studies majors, whether or not they go on to pursue careers in architecture, all came away with a sense of how the built environment crucially shapes women's lives. So in our discussion, our workshop time after this, I'd be very much interested to hear about engagements you've seen between departments or schools of architecture and gender studies, and your thoughts about how we might go about bringing architecture into gender studies programs to the benefit, I hope, of all involved. I think that if we can make connections between architecture and gender studies, there will be many benefits for faculty and students, as well as for the institutions more broadly. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Heidi Hussa, and I'm going to be talking about why feminism is needed in studio, which is obviously the core of architecture education, and it's a melting pot for students and ideas, both in class and afterwards, and it can be simultaneously a pretty great, but also a pretty terrible and sleep-deprived place, but definitely it's a place full of plenty of young adult males who can also be pretty great and pretty terrible simultaneously, sometimes without even realizing it. So I'm going to be sharing some stories about both blatant sexism and microaggressions that I've witnessed and that I've also experienced as a result of the ingrained behavior of males, and offer a few solutions as how educators can positively recognize gender and discourage sexism in the studio. I do believe that if sexism is addressed early on in education, maybe it won't continue into the workplace. So about myself, I'm a non-traditional student, and I went into architecture school knowing that there is a disparity between males and females, and I expected some form of sexism, but I did not expect that sexism to come predominantly from the other students. But it did, not too much of it, but it was definitely there, and I'm sure this isn't a rarity. I guarantee you that this is the case in all studios, whether or not you realize it. And like I said, I witnessed both blatant sexism and microaggressions, which are these like minor sexist things that students might do or say without even realizing they are saying something sexist. And so I want to share some of the stories of my classmates. So Rebecca is the second year, she's younger than me, and she's going through that period of time in her life where she is having self-esteem and body issues, as every young 20-something girl has, which is pretty typical. And she actually confided in one of the males in the studios, who went on to tell a bunch of other males in the studios what she said. And it wasn't soon before I overheard them, you know, just making these subtle jokes about her and kind of objectifying her, which really wasn't fair. I believe that studio culture does in some way allow for this sort of macho herd mentality. And if one boy is laughing at Rebecca's problems, it's okay for all the other boys to laugh at it, and they don't really think it's that big of a deal. So next I want to talk about, sorry, go back. Chris, who's 19, and she's a first year. And in the first year studios, they have these really great mentor programs where they have an older student come in and kind of guide the younger students. But in Chris's case, her mentor was a 22-year-old boy who developed a huge crush on her. And this led this boy to go on to touch her, text her incessantly, ask her to hang out outside of studio when he should have just been there to mentor her. And there wasn't this boundary established. So this reminded me of the phrase coined by Kainaleski about the watched woman. And basically, Chris, she doesn't feel comfortable in studio because she has this male that's kind of like paying attention to her in this overtly sexual way, when he should be guiding her and not doing that. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with that Architectural Review article a while back. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Architectural Review article a while back about why women leaving architecture. I kind of crafted my own unofficial survey one night really late in the studio, and I decided to run around and kind of just like ask people from a list of, a list of answers that I fashioned after the answers from the Architectural Review article about why they would not want to continue their architectural education. And I actually didn't think that gender-based discrimination would be as high up on the list as it was, but surprisingly, a lot of that was the #1 issue for a lot of the girls I asked. So it is actually an issue. Anyway, so the stories that I've told, along with countless others I could tell, are examples of gender bias in studio. I propose that we approach sexism in a couple of different ways. I think we should be designing with gender in mind, creating safe spaces, and exposing students to more female architects, crits, and mentors to show that women do belong in architecture. So, next slide. One of the first things I found when I looked up buildings for women was that screenshot right there. And that was just one of many different things of buildings for women, which always has some sort of stereotypical women as a homemaker sort of connotation to it. And so some of the answers are like, put a big kitchen in it, or, like put a sewing room in it. And I think that even though those things are necessary for some women, there are so many more women in the workforce now, and it's not really what we want to be thinking about. I think that the default person that we design for when we design studio projects is always kind of like a male, We're never asked to address questions like, where is a nursing area for women to go? Or maybe the 10-foot high ceilings are too high for someone who might not be 6'8". We rarely, if ever, talk about the cultural or just realistic gender-specific ideas in our projects, but I think we should to make males in studio see outside of themselves. So next, I'm starting a feminist organization at NJIT right now called Feminism at NJIT. And for that, I've instituted a safe space policy, which in young feminist circles, a safe space is basically a place where there is a no tolerance policy for any sort of gender or race-based bias. I don't have the time to read this all right now, but the policy I made in the feminist organization might be a bit much for a studio environment, but I think some sort of like supplemental studio code, in addition to the policy of the school that points out that there shouldn't be this sort of bias in studio would be really helpful. And finally, there are countless female architects in the world, as we're all aware, and I know there are generally less females than males, but it really wouldn't kill professors to be aware that they should be including these female architects in the curriculum, even if they're not as famous as me's. Our icons in studio are more often than not almost all male, almost all white, and almost all dead. But there's also Zaha Hadid, there's Norma Sklarek, there's Louise Bethune. There are so many other women that we need to be pointing out, even if they're not the most important women, in terms of analytical, importance, that give girls role models within the profession. So I don't know, I just want to, point out the fact that we don't live in a post-gender world, and the studio isn't gender blind, and academia doesn't really do enough to prepare men and women for the realities of sexism that they should be noticing, or to encourage women that they belong in architecture. But the global workforce is demanding that we have a diverse, we put diversity in our workers, and we need to change that if architecture is going to stay relevant. So thank you.
Hi, I feel I should issue a disclaimer first of all. I'm British, so I'm going to speak a lot more slowly than everyone else. Only because I can't even order a latte in this city without people being completely confused by what I'm saying. And I wasn't aware this was an audition for a words per minute competition prize at the end. So feminism is a design tool. This is what I think. Why is it a design tool? Because like any other design tool, it influences the processes of production, expression, perception of design ideas, and involves a unique and specific set of creative skills. But really, how does it do this? Well, feminism does this because it doesn't assume that necessarily one size fits all. It thinks modular man may actually have only really been intended as a prototype for Buzz Lightyear, and was not to be used as a guiding principle for setting spatial norms. Feminism knows, he's gone back, thank you, about life on the periphery, about the personal as well as the societal cost of excluding people. It identifies with others who are marginalised and knows the importance of and relevance of their experiences in terms of determining the needs of wider society. So, just like design, feminism requires activism, disruption, and radicalism. The processes are needed to achieve good design are the same. Feminism has to embody these in order to endure and to remain relevant. Activism brings about change, such as a change to the emphasis on teaching the architecture of 5 men, Sullivan, Mies, Corbusier, Wright, and Geary, which dominates the curricula of architecture worldwide. So a starting point would be to teach the architecture of 5 women too. Jane Drew, Denise Venturi-Brown, Aileen Gray, Lena Bobardi, Mary Med, for example. And next we can move on to beyond the Western paradigm and to buildings designed without using architects, and so on. Disruption means challenging entrenched thinking, such as the notion that architecture should remain affordable and relevant to a rich few. And radicalism means the Latin for root, so it involves getting back to our root values, understanding that design is really about the desire to make a difference. Thanks. Feminism takes a critical position because it teaches us the importance of asking questions, and because it recognises that who gets to ask the question changes what the answers might be. Because it recognises that to be a peripheral or marginalised person is to be critical by default, excluded from the norm and the central mainstream. Because it challenges false assumptions and stereotypes, discrimination and inequality. Because it makes us critically examine ourselves, not just others, our relevance and impact on society, for example, by teaching us to think that buildings aren't always the right answer to people's needs. Just like good design, it teaches us to move beyond us and them. Good design should do all of these things too. Yes. Okay, so feminism concerns learning design beyond the masculine paradigm, because it recognises skills that are traditionally dismissed as feminine or soft, and are actually of huge value to the design process, because the long and inflexible hours of low pay, lack of part-time work, rigid schedules, overt and implied discrimination, bullying, unconscious bias, and the hierarchical nature of architectural practice are more than a women's problem. They damage men, they damage children and families, they undermine our profession, our commitment to being ethical. Good design seeks to design a better profession, and not just for our clients. It's the same problem in architectural education too. Children are actually banned from my campus. So if working conditions are not formally articulated, then the workplace operates on a set of assumptions, with the least powerful or secure left at the mercy of perceptions of their worth to the firm or employing agency. So feminism questions architecture's influence on social relations, society and community, just like good design does. Bad design, on the other hand, fails to recognise that it can have a huge role to play in causing social problems by building isolated, poor quality social housing, for example, with no supporting infrastructure, such as creches, clinics, community centres, transport links and schools, for example. Feminism shows us that designs need to meet the needs of communities. If it's going to do that, it needs to involve them in the process of design. It understands that real sustainability isn't just about low-energy cladding conceived in CAD space, but about the social responsibility that extends beyond our practice, beyond the material buildings we create. Feminism, like good design, is all about setting the conditions for good, inclusive social relations. It doesn't do ghettos, whether spatial, social, material, any more than good design operates within discipline silos or constrained epistemologies. Feminism concerns designing beyond the gender binary. Feminism, like good design, knows that systems of classification can be misused as tools for meaningless separation. For example, sex polarised as females and males, sexuality polarised as homosexuals and heterosexuals, gender polarised as women and men, which reflect unnuanced series that, as Judith Lorber recognises, conventionalise body, sexuality and social location. Feminism, like good design, moves beyond outdated preoccupations about segregated spaces, recognising their role in maintaining inequality in society. Design needs to do what feminism had to do, to include, not to entrench. Feminism teaches ethics because, like good design, its history is about the rights and experiences of different and diverse individuals, not just the many groups each of us belong to. For example, we may be female, but we might be also transgender, Irish, own a dog, hate chocolate, but love tea, and might also be the CEO of a tech startup. After all, we aren't only architects, but we're spatial stakeholders, just like the public we design for. Feminist ethics builds on the belief that, much like design, we have traditionally undervalued and underappreciated the experience and rights of those other than ourselves, and it therefore chooses to reimagine ethics through a holistic feminist approach to transform it. If the built environment is for everyone, then surely it should be designed by everyone. Feminism identifies the political implications of design and planning. It recognises the role women have played in shaping policies, but as Dolores Hayden points out, their contribution to it has been marginalised, obscured from history. It recognises that, just like design, it can establish rules, trends, and new kinds of cultural ideals that can move far beyond the context in which it's situated. It seeks to engage with complex policy problems, methods for designing better policies, and review and reinvent the traditional tools used by analysts and policymakers. It recognises that, as women remain the primary caregivers but make up the majority of the global workforce, the personal is political. For this reason, our personal experiences need to directly inform spatial policy making. Taken all this together, feminism, like good design, exposes the problems in current practice and within the education system too. It defines a strategy for resistance and change that feeds forward into the future we want and not just sits within the future that we've inherited, which of course is exactly what good design should do too. I spent part of my childhood in a care home that wasn't caring. I went to a school where I didn't learn anything. I worked in an office where I didn't have to think or actually do any work. I guess I'm really here today because, like feminism, I simply chose to persist. I love the fact that my 18-year-old students rock up in tutorials calling themselves feminists and they have absolutely no idea who Germaine Greer is. What feminism taught me is to imagine and articulate how things could be different. Good design needs to do this in order to build a sustainable architectural culture for the future. Thank you.
These were all fantastic, and yeah, they were fantastic. And I think I would actually like, if you were willing, to respond to each other first in terms of actions we can move forward with before we open it up to the audience. I mean, one thing that seems that tracks through all of your talks is the role of gender, whether it's thinking about how we use it as a proactive tool versus trying to completely undermine it and it becomes something else. But I think it was really interesting how all of you are addressing this, but in incredibly diverse and different ways. And I would like your kind of immediate responses to one another, because you haven't had the opportunity to see each other as I had prior to this event.
Can I just say again, for those who weren't here yesterday, that the workshop is maybe not for everybody. This is an opportunity to really engage here with a discussion that is supposed to lead to positive positions that we can take back to the academy. So if you don't want to actually be a part of that discussion group, you don't have to stay around, you can do it. But it's not a question and answer period, it's actually an opportunity to bring those things forward. So anyway, just to
thank you.
say that.
So I would love it, and it's very reactionary, but your responses to each other in terms of, as we create this list or this working list, what are your responses? I mean, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I'm very curious how you're responding to each other.
I guess I'll go first. I would love to bring all of you back to Qatar to share your experiences with my students. I think that, there's some low-hanging fruit in a way. The suggestion by Harriet that we teach about the 5 women of architecture rather than the 5 men of architecture, and maybe even look beyond buildings made by architects to buildings made by non-architects and outside of the practice, as it's traditionally defined, is a great thing to consider when we're teaching our students. I use the book. I'm forgetting the name of it now. I can't think of the name of it, but the very fundamental book on architecture. Can anyone remind me? Pardon me? No. That we use in studio all the time. Ching, thank you. Francis Ching. How dare I forget the name? And your presentation just got me thinking, I wonder how many examples exist in that book that have been created and designed by women.
Maybe I can go back to something that was talked about a little bit yesterday about the normal. And I think in so I arrived recently at Woodbury, and in putting this together, we had a lot of conversations. There was a real, as you may know now, there's a lot of interest in this in Woodbury. There are a number of our faculty who are very interested in this symposium. But what is fascinating to me about the department and the school we have is that the normal is a little bit different than other places I've been. And the fact that all of our structures, for example, is taught by women, that's a normal thing. That's not different. It's actually pretty great. And I think, this is kind of something really special that's happening at Woodbury. And I wanted to sort of mention a little bit about the studio and the critique culture that, I think we've all experienced. I think my experience is obviously different than many in the room for sort of just really simple gender issues, but we don't have to make the crit that we have where there's, 4 white guys sitting in front of a student. We don't have to make that normal. And I think that one thing I know many of us have tried to do, but sort of just changing that is actually a really simple thing, right? Changing the review format. That's a really, really simple thing. And it doesn't have to be as horrible as it is for most people. It's an incredibly empowering experience if you come away with a great review, but it can also be an incredibly devastating experience. So a lot of the things that have been discussed, especially this last presentation, good design, good thinking. I think the question of feminism that's been opened up here leads to things that are beyond gender issues, and I think it leads to good design. And I think for me, one big great takeaway is just questioning the normal. Why does it have to be this way? And really being much more aware of others and other perspective. I think it's quite important, but it can also be really simple. So I really appreciate all the presentations. Thank you.
I wanted to add to that and just say that how nice it is to have so many students on the panel this morning and to hear students who feel like, well, I'll use a cliche word, empowered to influence the format in which their education is delivered to them. And I'm wondering if you guys could talk about whether you have you feel like you have opportunities to actually influence the curriculum or the format in which you're receiving an education. Whether you feel like the administration or the faculty of your schools is open to student input and to designing an educational program that reflects the student constituency and is responsive to the needs of the constituency rather than just adhering to time-honored canons and traditions for the delivery of education.
I think the question was about whether or not the schools are responsive to students asking for change in the way that we're receiving our education. And I would say that in some ways they are. I've had a couple examples in my experience at Yale where someone has spoken up about a certain topic and then the class comes around, or I was on the curriculum committee and we did a survey. But there are some things like studio culture, right? That is, that's part of the culture in architecture school specifically that I was trying to address in my talk. And I think that a lot of those norms, they're not explicitly gendered, but they have a masculinized history. And so, the crypt becomes a ritualized performance and that's something that gets repeated and legitimized every time we do it, which is why I brought up that Butler quote. And I think I would say from my own experience, in some ways I have very much valued having to have that fight every day, and I acquired a very tough skin, and I won my ticket to the boys club in the end. I was head TA to Peter Eisenman for a while, which is also why I feel comfortable making fun of him, because he really, it's a really tough experience, and you have to have a really tough skin. But then after studio is over, I feel like there was a time where I had to learn to soften myself again. And so I wonder, in some ways, that experience was very valuable in learning to be very strong, but I wonder what has been lost along the way, and could studio culture be softer and more welcoming? And so I really appreciate that question of challenging the norms, because I do believe that sometimes things are lost along the way.
Laurie? Carol? I'm suggesting that we just change the title, work with the title as an action. Gender and family politics need to be part of the career preparation of all architects. And I don't know if it's in the NAP criteria yet, but it absolutely should be added. And I think we need a feminist studio, at 50-50 at least. Because it shouldn't be something that's critiquing the studio. There should be a form, and if someone has an imagination of what a feminist studio looks like, and I can talk about my studio I took with Susanna Torre to describe what a feminist studio was all about, and how all the boys that were in the undergraduate studio with her embrace feminism. But I really want to thank Victoria for coming here, and because one of the first things that happened that came across my desk as the dean of the School of Constructed Environments here in Parsons, part of the Progressive New School, was a new gender and sexuality certificate program in graduate studies. And Robert, I don't know if you remember that, the Associate Dean of SE, Robert Kirkbright, the curriculum committee sent us a document that said this is of no interest to our graduate programs here in the School of Constructed Environments. Of course, I sent it back to the committee immediately, but I imagined another dean accepting that. And so the granularity discussion, I think Deborah brought up yesterday, I think is really important. And so the Joy McKinney, who's been the big part of accepting this, is the curricular, manages all the curriculum through and is now through this experience super empowered, and so she has included the courses that go through her desk and tags ones that she sends to gender and sexuality studies at the new school. So even if it's not acknowledged by the curriculum committee or even the authors of those courses, it's in there. And so, and that's really great that there's someone at a staff level who can embrace these things and make them happen. So I just really appreciate that. We did have a presentation offered from our gender and sexuality studies, but they would have presented their gender sexuality studies without architecture. So thank you for coming.
I wanted to put a few things out there. My colleague Annie Chu, also from Woodbury, and I were recently we formed a committee, and we developed a diversity plan for the for our school, and the hope is to implement it with the university. And I'd be very happy to share that diversity plan with people, because it's very, well, it's short, which is unusual coming out of a committee. But one of the things we did talk about, we had just undergone a mandatory training on identifying sexual harassment, and that's something all of our staff and faculty are required to do. And we talked about doing something similar with gender, and really addressing things like subconscious bias or unconscious bias. And So I think that's one very actionable item that you can take away with. And we try to address every level, from students to faculty, staff, administrators, boards. We talked a little bit about the board issue yesterday. So that is, and we worked also with people outside of the School of Architecture, people in HR, in our student services, so that it would begin to be accepted, and it is very much part of the hallmark, I think, of our university to deal with diversity. And to see diversity as a strength. And so I think that's an unusual position also. Our students are different from you. And we do have a very diverse group of students. We don't have very many women students in architecture, which is unusual. So we have about 30% of our student body are women. We have a lot of Hispanic students. We have a lot of Armenian students. We have a lot of African-American students. More than you see in most universities. And those students tend to have other challenges, and they're financial is the primary challenge, I would say, that our students face. And it's interesting when you start to talk to them about gender issues, and they don't understand or embrace it in the way that you do, and it's refreshing to hear your perspective. But I do think that, and I don't think we should water this down, because I do believe that we have to talk about gender, but I do think diversity and recognizing underrepresented populations is something we all need to attend to, as well as the feminist issue. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then finally, in my lectures, the canon, yesterday you brought up the canon, and I love the idea of at least a takeaway, sharing syllabi. And one of the things that I do, because I have a problem, besides Lena Bobardi and the obvious contenders, what I do very often, and I lecture on technology, is I look outside of the discipline. So I look at Petra Blaise and Eva Hesse, and they themselves are pioneers in their own disciplines, and use them as examples and the work that they do as examples to exemplify architectural concepts. So that is something, yes, there are very few women published architects in terms of the theoretical positioning that you were talking about that are pointed to. But I think that if we broaden the notion of design, Deborah Sussman came up yesterday, for example, as truly a pioneer in environmental design, then you can draw all sorts of examples into the lectures and enrichen the conversation. So, thank you.
I just wanted to add a comment. I really appreciate your diversity plan at Woodbury and hearing about that, and I think it's quite applicable to student cases that I think Heidi was describing in her presentation about if we're going to integrate students actively into the architectural education process, then they also need to be kind of trained into the professional atmosphere as well. And that transition from becoming a child teenager into the university atmosphere and mentoring others, I think is very important in introducing a structure for that to happen.
I think the issue of mentoring is really critical, and I think mentoring students all along the way. So I think you had mentioned that there's a first-year mentoring program at NJIT, and there is at Syracuse as well, but then it stops. And I think one action I really have been trying to speak to my administration about is how do we create a mentoring program that tracks all the way through the educational process. And I think that could also be beneficial as well in the grad program, but I think that needs to be more institutionalized so that there is a mentoring system that works with older students, younger students, but that advances as you advance.
I mean, I'd like to take that one step further as well. I think that, we have issues with retention of women in architecture just generally. Half the first years in BA are female, right? But by the time you get to registration, 20% are female. So there's a real problem with that, and I think that one of the ways you can do it is get the young women joining architecture education at the moment to sort of feed forward. If we empower them to be more autodidactic, for example, give them modules to run where they can set their own curriculum agendas. That's one way of getting them to tell us what they want prioritised, how they want to be taught, the kind of content and speakers and everything else they want involved. I think that would do a lot to tell the rest of us in academia about what's missing from our curriculum and do something to, if you like, engage them really early on as a means to secure their participation in the long term.
I think also in regard to the curriculum, I mean, actually, Elisa and I are in this amazing position where we have access to women like Dolores Hayden, who is, taught in the canon of gender studies and has such an amazing background, and Michelle Addington and Keller Easterling and Deborah Burke and Peggy Deemer and all these people that are teaching in the school, but that almost in the way that you're presented, at least in the beginning of their curriculum, you have to sort of work to get to those people. And I took Dolores Hayden's class last semester in my last year and felt like it opened up so many things for me. And if I had taken that course, if it was required in the first semester, maybe as opposed to Peter Eisenman's class on formal analysis or something such as that, it would have, it's like this painful thing, like we're so close to having access to that, and we're in this really fortunate position to have these amazing women practitioners and academics, but the way that the school formats and the way that the school prioritizes doesn't allow the people that really want to work with Keller or Dolores or Deborah get there, but it's not presented as a larger, everyone has to take Peter Eisenman's course. Not everyone has to take Dolores Hayden's course, and that's kind of mind-blowing to me because she's such an amazing figure in that conversation, and she presents things very architecturally, but also deals with many of these issues we're discussing. So I would love, to pose that question of how we kind of don't ignore the importance of that, Renaissance architecture and the formal analysis of that, but also incorporate other components into that.
Yeah.
I was actually going to pick up on Kelly's comment about Qing, because there are certain texts that find their way across many at the introduction of many curricula, and we're talking about sort of turning those things on their head in a number of different ways. And so to actually think about, having texts that are available that actually do the things that we're talking about, I think could be a really important step. So having that be as common as Qing in the introduction portion of architecture.
So my colleague Marc is the editor of the Journal of Architectural Education, and I'd like to
give each other props.
and I'd like to challenge him. When was the last time JAE did an issue on feminism and?
All right, here we go. Thanks. 2 points there. It's been too long, probably, surely, but we do. So a number of years ago, I was appointed as the executive editor. The first issue that we did was on Design Plus. It's called it was asking the question about architectural agency, and a lot of the conversations on the editorial board had to do with what do architects do and what was JAE about and all this. Seems like the question always came up. For me, the big issue, which goes beyond gender, is actually agency, how we actually affect change in some way. And so I think that issue was sort of important in a bigger context. So it wasn't specifically about gender per se or feminism, but it did ask about architectural agency. The next thing we did was to have an open call. And so the open call for themes was put out. We received about 45 different theme issues, which was actually much more than I anticipated. And as a board, we discussed that. So to turn this around, we will have an open call this summer again. And I would propose to any of you out there, if you're interested, please propose an issue, and it'd be great. We have a recent tradition of actually having theme editors edit issues. It's not something that the board does entirely by ourselves, but we actually bring people in to edit themes. So we're open, it'd be great. The other part of that, though, I think goes back, or the other comment I want to make is that we've made a commitment on the board to have a diverse board, and we have the luxury of having a diverse board. We have an incredible group of people. It's the, as has been said in the past, it's the best faculty meeting you never got to go to. It's great people are there. It's diverse. It's fantastic. So I think that we sort of demonstrate diversity. We don't have to, or we don't necessarily perhaps talk about it or publish on it, but we demonstrate it, and I think that's important. But that said, the theme issue will be out, or the call for themes will be out. Please send us good stuff. And thank you for putting me on the spot. I don't feel on the spot enough already.
One of the things that I thought would come up with this, and I guess I hope to hear more about, in setting up this particular session, which is gender equality and family versus curriculum, was a division that, let's say curriculum is about content, and I think content is totally important. I think in all sessions we can't help but avoid content, but part of what can be discussed here is the particular way that we do perform femininity, and so I really appreciate, Elisa, your discussing that from the student point of view, and Kelly, I think you were talking about your self-consciousness about how you're seen as nurturing or whatever, but I guess I would like to suggest, or maybe hear more of a conversation about how it is that not just in the content of what we deliver, feminism, when is it in the curricula, do we do it, is it in theory, is it in relationship with things outside of architecture, but how it is that we as teachers actually perform our particular identities, because I think it's not talked about, and I think it's difficult, and part of it has to do with how much those of us who teach reveal about our own personal lives, reveal about our own difficulties in work-life balance or children and all those different things. How much is that, or should it be a part of our exposure in our discussions with our students, or not? I think in some way we as women and men are modeling femininity or identities in some way, not just through what we teach, but how we teach it, and how we all here, because it's an opportunity to talk about it, how we feel that we model that, as opposed to just deliver it in some way. So I think it's an important issue.
Peggy, thank you for raising that. It's one that I've been thinking about as well, and I would just answer your call to say that I explicitly address these questions in my teaching, that I teach a survey of architecture course, survey of world architecture course, sometimes one semester, sometimes both, spring and fall, and I always introduce myself. I always say, this is my career path. I went back to school with kids. I did this. You can do this. And it's, we have a lot of students at City College who are what we call returning students, meaning students who come back to school after having having done other things in their lives. And I think it's important to know that there are other people on the faculty who have done this as well. We also have students, and like at Woodbury, we have a largely working class undergraduate population, largely new Americans from one part of the world or another. And if thinking about feminism is perhaps a bit of a challenge, and it isn't always, certainly dealing with work-life balance for all of our students, if you think of education as work, is on the plate all the time. And my students have children to take care of, their siblings, they have to earn a living, they have all kinds of questions that the core values of feminism, I think, address, and that we need to extend and make ourselves open to. And in fact, I think one of the great challenges of mentoring is to understand when so-called poor academic performance is in fact an indicator of rather huge challenges that are undergoing in a student's life, where one as a faculty member can intervene to to create the kind of support network that a student needs. And I can tell you that they are there, and I'm speaking about domestic abuse, child abuse, about one story, which I think is just, this, about a young woman who came from the DR, from the Dominican Republic, as we call the uptown, that's the DR, is the Dominican Republic, I was teaching a course on childhood, I guess it was childhood and architecture, I can't remember exactly the topic. But regardless, it was a socially based class, and she just wasn't coming to class. She was always, you can't do this. And then it turned out that what she was doing, the reason she was late was because She was taking her brothers and sisters to school every morning, her 3 brothers to school, because her mother had left her, right? A 19-year-old taking care of 3 kids under 10. And so what we need to do, she can't not finish school. To not finish school would be the worst thing to happen to this young woman. But the most important thing for her to do is to finish and get her degree. On the other hand, she can't do it if she can't get to class. So these are the kinds of questions we face and that we need to face as feminists, I believe.
Well, in the spirit of what actions can we take away, I'm curious in terms of institutional support structures, are there things that are set up or in the process of being established to really work with students like that? At your school in particular, since you brought up the example.
I think there is the relationship of faculty to advisors is an enormously important one, and so I think for faculty to be attuned to what are the signs of stress in students, to unpack those signs of stress and not to just take, this connects with studio culture in a huge way, that not doing the work is an indication of laziness or as you pointed out, not manning up. In fact, the not doing the work may be, in fact, due to a whole set of other constituent causes that a faculty member needs to help figure out, and then make sure the student gets the help that the student needs. But that deals with this whole gendered culture of performance that doesn't in any way deal with work-family balance, right? I mean, it just doesn't.
I have an action item that is inspired by all of the things I see being written, and I'm encouraged by all of the efforts and strategies that people are putting forward to diversify existing institutions. But my Barnard education and my recent move to San Francisco, I think, are conjoining in me an idea of a startup all-female architecture program that is a safe space. I'm hearing the students struggling with the same things I struggled with when I left Barnard, understanding what I thought was normal, how to be normally addressed, normally evaluated, to exist and be creative as an unwatched person, as a free person, putting my work into the world, and then to be shocked at what I considered to be absolutely not normal in my master's education, the way I was observed and addressed and evaluated. And I think a lot of these things, it might be a really radical proposition, but I wonder how many people here went to an undergraduate all-women's college. And high school, and I'm sitting in a room with so many of the incredible women who mentored me and who taught me, who were alone mostly in their institutions in my experience, and who had such power and impact when they were at Barnard with me. And I really think that that's a big agenda item. There should be a startup, maybe you do a summer abroad at an all-women's institution and you meet all your mentors and they're allowed to help you and free to help you outside the context of this battle, that these students are waging. And I did it too at my institution, and I applaud it that it's you're in there and you're trying to change things, and even all the faculty here is in there trying to change things. And I just am suggesting a place where you don't have to fight that battle, that you just go somewhere for a little while and do good work.
I think I would like to say something to that effect, in that one of the goals of our group has been to try to create that space within the university and allow our sort of women professors to present themselves the same way that men do in the academic setting, but to create smaller gatherings. For example, Deborah Burke's been very supportive of the group and has actually had sort of smaller dinners with us where we do discuss things like motherhood or other things that I wouldn't ask her to discuss in her classroom setting, but it's actually really nice to have for her to take the time out to do that. Well, we still are all part of the academy, and we all are sort of equals in that setting, but to identify that those moments are actually really important to the female students to take that time out, and I really have appreciated that time that she's given.
Yeah, and I'd like to add also in terms of Peggy's question of how it affects performance as a teacher. And you reminded me, Peggy, of a moment I had. I had Peggy in my second year of Urban Studio, and it was a team project, and it was about the 4th or 5th week of school, and nobody had pulled an all-nighter yet, and we were sitting in studio kind of confused, and we have this moment of silence, and my friend says, maybe it's because she's a mother. And I realized it was the first time I had ever had a female studio critic also, and so it really made me think that there was a difference, in having a teacher or a professor who was actually interested in being kind to their students. And as a result, we had time to think in our studio, and we created this, political utopia between all of us that was really fun to work on and think on and make drawings for. And it was very different from the slog of first year when the point was to produce, and we did a lot of crappy work because it was such a rush, and so it made a really big difference. So I just wanted to answer your question, Peggy, with that story.
I want to follow up on that and also follow up on Catherine's. Catherine teaches, basically she's the chair of interior design up in CCA, and we don't want this to be a Woodbury blitz this weekend, but I teach in Woodbury, and I'm an architect and interior designer. I want to bring up a couple things. One is the fragility factor, which is that there's a lot of your younger students in their first and second year who, even upon being in the architecture program, might leave it. And the retention factor, and I'm counting on this as a personal experience, has to do with certain teachers who does not embrace the diversity of design thinking or emerging design thinking. There's a social-based agenda that's part of the core value of architecture that drew a lot of women into architecture because they do want to connect their career with a service to humankind in general. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes that kind of social-based agenda comes in the form of maybe people who are students, and you've experienced these students before, very concerned about that human experience at a granular scale in space and not particularly interested in the linear process of taking something from a partie into fruition. And I wanted to encourage everyone to really embrace those diversity of emerging design thinkers and understand that that is part of a feminist agenda to actually nurture those people, as well as to be aware that in other studios that they might encounter a very kind of aggressive way of thinking that is not particularly going to nurture them in the path towards a career in architecture. I also want to introduce Heather Peterson, who's actually there, who's another colleague of mine too, and I'm hoping that she would also talk about a Masters of Interior Architecture program agenda, which actually ties directly to action items. And I'm going to pass this on to Donna. Deborah's first.
Before we go, can I ask you to recap your action items? So I can
Recap, mentor diversity of design thinking styles.
Great, thank you.
Be aware and just be proactive about being in touch with your female students about other challenges they might have in other courses or encounters with other instructors who may not have that kind of awareness of the diverse ways that we approach design.
Thank you.
Just to continue the Woodbury Blitz over here. I'm actually glad that Donna has the mic, because part of what I want to say addresses is a question for something you brought up. I'm really glad to see the like a girl thing appearing again, and I think one of the great benefits of having students on the panel today is I think we're at what I would call maybe a like a girl moment in feminism and architecture. And I think it's important to maintain a posture of we come bearing gifts, and what are the strengths that we bring to the field as women. And when you mentioned that you feel that Gensler might actually be a place where there's
I hope you see it that way.
Huh?
I hope you've seen it that way.
Yeah, I do. I'm very curious about the comment because it's true that in a corporate environment, it might actually be more amenable, more receptive to a more balanced approach to work and life. And if women can bring anything to the field, maybe that's it. How to balance all of these different needs and tasks that we have to undertake. I think I'll just leave it there. But
Gensler was founded by Art Gensler, of course, but then there were 3 seminal partners, one of whom was a woman whose name I'm blanking on, but she's a fantastic woman. If you look her up, Chicago Women in Architecture honored her about 10 years ago. She gave this dynamite talk. In any event, what I wanted to add, building on your question of yesterday, was it just dawned on me that I'm teaching anew this course I taught for 15 years called Contemporary Chicago Architecture Case Studies. And so I was casting about in December about which case studies would we like to pursue in Chicago. And I landed on 4 of them. And it's just dawned on me that 3 out of the 4 are by women. Ann Beha at University of Chicago, Jeannie Gang at Northerly Island, and a young woman named Catherine Darmstadt, who's worth looking into. She was just selected by Crain's Chicago as 40 under 40 to watch across all business enterprises. And she's doing community-based design down in Pullman in Chicago and is an IIT graduate. So, you know, there's light horizon.
Hi, I'd like to offer my action item as the network. I think that it's really important that personally, I am an editor of a blog, Architects. We're a group here, based here in New York. It's Architects with an XX. And we're interested in really promoting the work of women who you haven't heard of. And we're interested in student stories. And we're using, I guess, more subversive feminist tactics, which I'm surprised haven't been mentioned, just the use of technology. We're using social media. We're using, blogs, ways that we don't need money and we don't need kind of we're using our network as kind of our strength and power. And I don't know, there's so many people on the panel who I'd like to have your emails. I'd like to reach out to you. I'd like to hear about the safe space policy. We'd like to feature our diversity plan on your blog. We'd like to really use the exposure that we have being based here in New York and having an international network to strengthen what we're doing here. And I think, how we formed was part of a response to women getting together at a panel that Lori hosted at Van Allen a while ago. And I think that that's really our strength, and that's our access to the younger people, because they're all on Instagram, they're all on Twitter, and that's how we can connect in a pretty broad way. And so I think, I don't know if that can, I know that I do our Instagram account for the group, and I know that we connect with a lot of schools that way and a lot of people in Australia, and there's really strong movements across the globe that I think we can be tapping into without money and without prestige. And I welcome you to really check out our work, because we have we've been thinking about this, and we've been really putting forth a lot of energy into action items and into encouraging schools to close their studios at 12. It's ridiculous that they're open all night. People wouldn't be pulling all-nighters if the schools closed their doors. And there's a lot of ways that we're using writing as activism. We have a writing group, and we want to be promoting women to write their ideas down, or we're featuring work. And it's so great to hear, Victoria, the way that you're encouraging that. I'd love to, if you have avenues that we can, our authors, we're interested in getting their work out there, and we have these small avenues now, and we're interested in really broadening that and expanding that. And
I'd like to say the name of your group one more time.
Architects. Architects.
We
Yeah.
have a website, we have a blog, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram. Definitely follow
You can find her there.
Yes.
It's a much bigger than me.
Yeah.
I mean,
No.
I don't mean you.
But as a very important action item, I mean, I agree with what you said, that there's so many websites and contact points that I really want to make sure that I capture. And I was thinking as one action point from this conference is that we get that, or that we produce that list as an easy link, so that if we go back to this conference and search that, we will also find this list of, so that it can grow. Because I completely agree that it's, social media is making very many things possible. For example, we have in Sweden, there is this, I told some people about it yesterday, that there is this organization, a voluntary organization that produces lists of underrepresented. So it could be anything from architectural lecturers to security policy experts. Anywhere where somebody has said there aren't enough women, you can actually write to them and say, we have this problem, someone is saying there isn't enough women, and they will use social media to gather these lists and produce these lists. And it's just one small example, but a really great thing. What I take as an action item from the presentations that were really fantastic this morning is, and what really made me think, perhaps in different ways, was also all the student perspectives and the sexism in the studio, and how to deal with that. And that's why I thought the idea about the startup course, it's quite fantastic because there are all the possibilities and the kind of lucky possibilities in some schools where you get the networks going and you have the possibility, but to actually to start thinking institutionally about this as well, that this could be offers, and this could be actually, the university could take on this as projects to really do these safe learning environment courses. That's so. Thank you very much.
So, if I can just inject a little bit of healthy skepticism to some of the action items, and perhaps suggest one or two others. It's been my experience, not only my own, but we discussed this at a dinner the other night, that female faculty are expected by students and others to be very revealing about themselves. We partially through our mentoring, but also through nurturance expectations, women are asked questions about their own personal lives that people would never ask men. And so I want to just inject a note of caution that if we're talking about mentoring and about advising, that we have to be sure, and this is the action item, that all faculty, men and women, are taught how to mentor and advise. When faculty, whether men or women, are just asked to be advisors and they're asked by their students, what do I do? How do I approach it? The answer, I'm having problems. The answer is going to be something along the lines of what that faculty member experienced in their own educational experience. And I do frankly find that to be almost as often the case with women as with men, because women got through a system that was designed by men. So the action item there is to educate the entire faculty about diversity and about mentoring and about advising, and in fact go to experts who know how to do this. Architects, often faculty think they're experts in everything, but HR people, person who runs our office is very alert to issues of microaggression. The staff address these issues all the time. Our faculty, most of them don't know what that word means. So if we're talking about these kinds of things, we actually have to use expertise beyond the faculty to do that. The second action item is, maybe we can do a link to this if there's going to be a website. The Chronicle of Higher Education, there was an article a couple of months ago titled "Coming Out as Poor in an Elite University." And what this reminded me of is something that Brian mentioned yesterday, which is architecture is understood as a gentleman's profession. And by that, we can mean male, but we can also mean that a profession that requires that you have some money to enter into it. And so one of the things we do have to think about, whether we're teaching at universities that are considered non-elite, because I've taught at one of those, or universities that are elite, that we have expectations of what we expect our students to spend. We have no idea how expensive this education is, and we have to be very aware of it because it is a problem for diversity across the board. One of the reasons, even in elite schools, that students drop out is that they can't afford architecture education.
I'm going to ask you to put your second action item into an active verb form.
Yeah, it was read the article coming out as poor in higher education. And I'll provide the link.
I'd like to just second that. I mean, I feel like maybe this isn't true for everyone, but I feel like no one scrutinizes female faculty more than female students. Does anyone else feel that way? And I mentioned in my presentation that it's perhaps only through my teaching in Qatar that I embrace being labeled as generous or as nurturing. When I was a much younger faculty person, I would have never embraced that label. You're either a bitch, right, or you're soft. And why is that?
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on, I don't know your name, Shay's call, because we are sort of linked, though we don't know each other. We have sort of retweeted ourselves several times. I'm Feminist Wall, and I usually post gender ratios, but it's not me, it's like a group of a ton of people. But I just do the Tumblr. So I'm tweeting right now, but if anyone else feels like tweeting, I didn't find a hashtag. So I created one, it's Feminism and Arch, A-R-C-H. And there's a lot of people that we both know, and maybe a lot of people have sort of seen in the internet networks around the world that sort of started chiming in. So just use that hashtag because like people want to share this information. Okay.
Is that it? Feminism, A-N-D?
Feminism and Arch, no spaces. No.
I want to mention is just a similar project that we have underway at the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, which is built by women, that is trying to call attention on a very regular basis to architectural works by women. I also, I came to this meeting today really to bang a drum, and I hope you'll forgive me if I do it one more time. I wanted to ask how many women in this room, or how many people in this room, have taken a course in a gender studies department as part of their undergraduate or graduate education. So I'm actually thinking that to a certain extent that is the safe space that we're talking about, and maybe we don't need to create it, maybe it already exists in departments of gender studies where like-minded people who are interested in feminism, gender, and sexuality are getting together and organizing cross-disciplinary courses that don't include architecture, but I really think should and need to include architecture to bring more interested people into this community and to try and bring out more architects who are approaching the discipline fundamentally from the perspective of gender and sexuality. So those are my action items. Asking faculty members to affiliate themselves with departments of gender studies and asking students to take courses in gender studies and connect with those departments, because it's such I know that for myself as a graduate student in English, if I hadn't my first year taken a course with the late Carolyn Heilbrunn, who was part of the founding of gender studies curricula in the United States, I would not have made it. That was the gas in my tank, and I want to make sure that architecture students are filling up with that gas too. Thank you.
Carol, can you add one more thing to the action list? I think everybody in a position at an institution should go home and fight for affordability. I want to build on what you said. I think is extraordinarily important. Architecture is very expensive, and schools of medicine and law, our graduates don't make nearly as much money. Everybody comes out of college too much in debt in this country. Architects come out too much in debt and face low-paying jobs. Every architect in this room should pay every single person who works for them, no matter what. I happen to be associated with an elite institution, and even at an elite institution, we have dozens of chairs and near enough scholarships. I think we have to pay attention to what it costs to go to school and to rethink that paradigm. Maybe we need to be modeled on more PhD programs where students are fully funded rather than on a tuition-based model, which is clearly failing us in our attempt to be more diverse.
Okay. I wanted to add an action item, and maybe it's been brought up, but there's a campaign. It's actually a campaign online called Please Diversify Your Panel. And it's for men to sign up to not be on panels that don't have diverse representation on them. It's called PLZ, Diversify Your Panel. And so people are just asked to circulate it and to sign up for it, you know, whenever there's a panel.
So I see this as a safe space. So I'm going to turn on my soft side now. And I have a 6-year-old daughter and find myself with new filters. And I wanted to thank the three of you. And if my daughter is half as courageous and thoughtful as you, I will be a happy mama.
One thing we haven't talked about, and I was looking back at the title in terms of career preparation, is also tenure track faculty, like young faculty. And I think in terms of action, I know one thing I've been talking about with some of my own faculty, female faculty, is we have to create institutionalized mentoring systems. So the same thing I was talking about with students has to happen with faculty. It's not a part of my institution, so we're trying to work towards doing that. But if we're expecting for more women to rise through these ranks, we have to create an environment and support structure for that to happen. So my action is to create mentoring, institutionalized mentoring for women, young female faculty. And I guess that would be all faculty, actually. But because we've been talking about the numbers, specifically about female faculty.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, actually, as someone that is probably still on the younger end of being a full-time faculty member. And I actually started teaching when I was 22. So right out of undergraduate, I started teaching undergraduates and some graduate students, and I had to hide a little bit the fact of my youth because I think they would have been outraged and probably demanded their tuition money back. And I also was coming out of a fine art background. I did not have an architectural education, but I was teaching architecture studios. And I think I probably have had a very unusual set of experiences because for me, the primary slights that I've had have all had to do with sort of issues of ageism before, or at least the primary presenting characteristics had to do more with age than with gender. And those things are always very blended and kind of braided, but I think as an adjunct faculty, I never had any mentorship. And so it hasn't been until I've become a full-time faculty member that people like Ingalill and Annie Chu, and certainly a lot of male faculty also have been really great mentors in terms of my own development as an academic, how to sort of position myself within the discipline, how to take positions within curriculum and develop curriculum. But I think that, at least in the experiences that I've had as an adjunct faculty, it's entirely missing, or at least incredibly anemic. And I think that we could do better to include adjunct faculty in mentorship, because I think it is often very overlooked.
So how many of you in this room think we should have diversified this panel in terms of gender? I'm curious because it was a 50-50, certainly in our faculty. Should this be all women or should this be inclusive of men in the voice?
Diversity beyond men and females.
Yes, I agree.
But can you also speak to a bit of what happened as a result of your collaboration on this panel? Because I think it speaks to larger issues about why there aren't more men here, or transgender people here. So I think it's important for people to hear this. If you don't mind.
No, so from a philosophical background, I don't have the kind of tools to discuss feminism in the sort of larger trajectory. So that is not my background in a lot of ways. I think, though, there's a bigger issue, and that just has to do with, being human. And my interest in this panel was about that. So I can't say that I'm a card-carrying feminist. I don't have the background in that philosophically or in any other way. But what really surprised me when on our faculty, we talked about, there's a real great interest in this symposium in our faculty, and I said that I was putting in a paper, and I was basically told I shouldn't go, it's not my space. And that, sort of surprised me a little bit, but I can see the point in a way, I get it. So it was a little awkward, and there was a really interesting discussion that was had, but I personally do think this would be much more interesting if it was more diverse, and I do think it's not just a gender issue. This conversation shouldn't just be a conversation in a closed circle. I think networks are super, super important, and they're clearly beneficial to men. This has happened, historically, we all know this, and I think that women obviously should take advantage of this, whether or not it's technological or just simply social. It's super important. And they can be exclusionary. I think that's just going to happen. But I think a conversation like this becomes much, much more powerful when it's more diverse. And it goes to bigger issues, I think.
Can I just, it's related a little bit. I think that it just occurred to me as I was reading the title again, that there's another space within school that is also a space of career preparation that has an emerging patriarchy, actually. And that is technological. It has to do with fabrication and the digital turn. And I have noticed that it tends to be male-dominated and there's a kind of fear of it, the way there's a math fear. And it is, I actually realized I have a wonderful student in my class this term that ended up in my studio because she was in a studio that was going to ask her to do a lot of this fabrication using these digital tools, and she was too nervous to do it. And maybe there's an action, maybe you have so my action item would be to make sure there's the support and in a sense, the expectation that these tools can be assimilated by everyone. And I'm just wondering, given your presentation, whether you have an even better action item for that.
Fingers crossed on Monday. We have a number of major curriculum revisions that are going forward to the faculty to vote. One of those will be a required course in fabrication for everybody, which means that you have, at University of Michigan, with really great fab lab built by a woman. But the issue is really important, and we will tell all students, you only have to dip your toe, and you don't have to go back again if you don't want. But once they are in the door, we find all women who've used the Fab Lab once in a course go back to use it again. So it's requiring the use of these tools, not having your entire school taken over by it, but if you have a required course in representation, you have a required course in fabrication.
I have two action items for that. One of the hats I wear, I'm also the supervisor of our making complex, of our digital fab lab. And it's an unwritten rule, but I require my staff to hire at least 50% women to run the lab, to help run the lab. And that makes for an incredibly welcoming environment for people who may not be comfortable. The other action item I have, and it has to start much, much earlier, and making younger girls comfortable with technology. And so my colleague Janine and I started a program for middle school students architecture program, and it's 50-50, it's in terms of gender, and they're all required to work on do fabrication labs, do early robotics, Arduino, getting very comfortable with the lab. So that would be another opportunity.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the numbers that our Executive Dean Joel Towers said. We have 5,000 design students at Parsons, 70% women. We're undergoing a shared and safe making center environment that has been an incredible struggle, and we kind of piloted between fine arts and our school in the building some of you went to last night at 25 East 13th Street. So we have some learning from that we can share as well.
Can I just say one thing about the controversy about your being here in your school? From our point of view, for the moderators and Brian and I, when we were going through the different presentations and what absolutely had to be here, and when yours came through, it wasn't just like, thank God, a guy, but it was a guy with authority who is so proud of the women on the faculty. And so that as a model, the pride that I think other people in position of authority can take in constructing something that is as fabulous as that's a large part of what made this interesting. And I think it's important for other people in authority, whether male or women, to actually put forward in that very aggressive way the best practices that can be a model for everybody. Am I closing? Oh, but I want to say one. But I just want to say one thing. But can I? Okay, Lori closed. Can I just say, because I'm worried that this isn't going to said, in relationship to how we model our genders or femininity. One of the things that struck me about Harriet's presentation was, in some way, you were saying feminism equals critical theory. It just is the same thing, and I think in many ways that's totally true. You can't divorce critical theory from the women who have actually pushed it, and I think that's really, really true. I also think that feminism is architecture, and one of the things that I think attracted me to teaching architecture was that, unlike other forms of teaching where you have lecture courses and you sit up there as an authority, and drop your pearls to people you have to pick up, is that it's a conversation. And that, certainly that's true in studio. It's how you teach, it's one-on-one. And that is a kind of education that I think I feel comfortable with. I don't want to blanketly say that that's something that women are good at, but it feels a comfortable anti-authoritarian way of teaching, and I think we're good at that, and I think we should remember that is kind of a principle about how we actually do our teaching. And the aberration is the other one, the authoritarian one. We're teaching if it's going the way it should, in a naturally open, unhierarchical way, and that's why I like teaching architecture.
I guess we're concluding. I just want to thank all of you. It was, I'm sitting here kind of in awe. I'm so inspired, and especially the students. I think your perspective is so critical for us, not only for you to have a voice and a place of agency, but then for us to try and help and respond and empower you to keep speaking out. And I think these, what I had thought of as building solidarity between faculty, students, and units across campus is so critical, and I think we have to take a more proactive stance to do that. And I think organizations that you have started and that you are starting, we also have to figure out a way for them to have a lifeline after you graduate, because I know in instances with my own students, once those power people leave, it's sometimes hard to find people to take up the reins of amazing things that you have started. So we have to think about how do we help you, enable you to make that happen. And I think, I think the engagement between faculty and students and how we prepare you and how we prepare us to do what we're trying to do is so critical, and clearly there has to be more work towards that. So there's so many things that this session I walk away with, and I think we need to take action and move on and do something as a result of this. So I just want to thank you for your honesty and your willingness to participate in this. So thank you.
Wow, all this work has made me hungry. We do have sandwiches over here, but we have a nice long break so people can also enjoy some fresh air in New York City. So and networking, you're not confined to this room. So enjoy a sandwich, a soft drink. But we're gonna come 1:25. We're gonna start 1:30 sharp. So thank you.